Welcome to Cryptid Monologues. Let's dive into a world where myths meet imagination. Here we unravel chilling tales of cryptids, Bigfoot, Wendigos, dogmen, skinwalkers, and more. These stories are crafted to ignite your imagination. These stories are purely fictitious, and names and/or events are purely coincidental. If you like these kind of stories, please give a like and subscribe. Click on the notification bell to stay up to date. Thanks for listening. Let's get into it. Chapter 5: A Glimpse in the Night. The low growl echoed through the camp, sending a shiver down the spines of every man. The fire crackled weakly, its flames barely illuminating the surrounding darkness. The cattle shifted uneasily, their nervous lowing breaking the stillness. Jack tightened his grip on his revolver, scanning the tree line. "Stay sharp, boys," he called out, his voice steady but low. "Whatever it is, it's out there." Will and Hank stood side by side, rifles ready. Will's hands were shaking, but Hank placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Steady, kid," Hank whispered. "Fear'll make you shoot before you're ready." Then it came, a sudden, violent crash from the far side of the herd. The cattle bellowed in panic, their hooves pounding the earth as they surged together. "Hold the herd!" Jack shouted, running toward the commotion. Mateo and Jed were already there, rifles raised, their lanterns casting shaky beams of light into the chaos. The men caught a glimpse of something massive moving just beyond the circle of light, taller than a man, with broad shoulders and a hulking silhouette. It moved with startling speed, vanishing into the trees before anyone could react. "What was that?" Jed hissed, his voice trembling. Mateo shook his head, his lantern swinging wildly. "I don't know, but it's fast and big." Jack cursed under his breath. "Everyone stay together. No one goes into the trees." The rest of the night was tense. The strange growling continued, moving around the perimeter of the camp, keeping the men on edge. Whatever was out there didn't attack again, but it didn't leave either. When dawn finally broke, the camp was a somber scene. The men looked exhausted, their faces pale from the sleepless night. Jack gathered them for a quick count of the cattle. "Let's make sure the herd's intact before we move," he said, his voice tight. As the men began checking the herd, a shout rang out. "Jack, over here!" It was Jed, standing near the edge of the grazing area, his face pale. Jack, Mateo, and Will rushed over, rifles in hand. What they found made their stomachs churn. A cow lay sprawled on the ground, its body torn open. The carcass was mutilated in a way none of them had ever seen. Deep gashes that looked more like claws than knives, and the head twisted at an unnatural angle. "Good Lord," Will whispered, his voice barely audible. Mateo crouched near the carcass, his expression grim. "This wasn't rustlers. No man could do this." Jack nodded, his face set. "It's that thing, the hairy man." Hank ran a hand through his hair, his usual calm shaken. "It's toying with us, watching us, waiting to see what we'll do next." Jack stood, his jaw clenched. "Well, we're not giving it what it wants. We move the herd today, double time. We stick together, keep the fire high at night, and stay armed." As the drive pushed onward, the mutilated cow weighed heavily on the crew. The men worked in tense silence, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon and the tree line. Will couldn't stop replaying the night in his mind, the hulking shadow, the guttural growls, the cow's mangled body. He rode alongside Hank, who seemed unusually quiet. "You think we're in over our heads?" Will finally asked. Hank sighed, adjusting his hat. "This trail's always been dangerous. Storms, rustlers, snakes. You take your chances every time you set out. But this is something else." That night, the men set up camp in a wide open area, hoping the lack of trees would give them an advantage. The fire was piled high, casting long shadows across the prairie. Jack addressed the men as they huddled around the flames. "We've got a long way to Montana, and whatever this thing is, it's not going to scare us off. We stick together. We stay alert, and we get the job done. Understood? The men nodded, their resolve strengthened by Jack's steady leadership. But as the fire crackled and the night closed in, Will couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still watching, waiting for its next move. The days passed with a strange rhythm. The cattle plodded forward, their lowing subdued, their movements more skittish than usual. The men kept a tight formation around the herd, their rifles always within reach. Each night, the signs of the creature grew bolder. Tracks circled the camp, larger and more frequent. The strange guttural growl became a nightly presence, sometimes so close it seemed the beast was just beyond the firelight. Despite Jack's calm authority, the strain on the crew was beginning to show. "Reckon this thing's just toying with us," Jed muttered one evening as he helped Will stack more wood on the fire. Will glanced at the older man, his jaw tight. "What do you mean?" Jed spat into the dirt, his eyes on the distant tree line. "It could have hit us hard that first night. Took one of us, maybe the herd, but it didn't. It's messing with our heads, making us jump at shadows." Will swallowed hard, the image of the mutilated cow flashing in his mind. "Why would it do that?" Jed shrugged, his voice lowering. "Maybe it's curious, or maybe it's just mean." The next morning, while scouting ahead of the main group, Mateo and Hank came upon a large, ancient oak tree standing alone in the middle of the plains. Its trunk was hollowed out, a jagged opening that gaped like a mouth. "Tracks," Mateo said, pointing to the dirt around the base. Hank dismounted, his rifle at the ready. The tracks were fresh, impossibly large, and led directly to the tree. As he stepped closer, the smell hit him, a foul, musky odor that made him gag. "You smell that?" Hank said, covering his nose with a bandana. Mateo nodded, his face pale. "It's like wet fur and death." Cautiously, Hank peered into the hollow. Inside, tangled in the darkness, was a collection of bones, some animal, some disturbingly human-looking. Hank stepped back, his heart pounding. "We found its den." Mateo's eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. "If this is where it's been, it's not far from us. We need to move." That evening, a storm rolled in, the kind that seemed to come out of nowhere on the open plains. Lightning split the sky, casting stark shadows over the camp, and the wind howled like a living thing. Jack ordered the men to keep the herd close and the fire blazing despite the rain. "No one goes more than 50 paces from camp," he barked. "We're not losing anyone to the weather or anything else." The storm raged through the night, but even over the sound of the wind and thunder, the men heard it, a deep guttural howl that rose above the chaos. Will froze, his rifle clutched tightly. "Did you hear that?" Hank, standing beside him, nodded grimly. "Loud and clear." The howl came again, closer this time, and then another sound, a heavy thud, like something massive landing on the ground. The cattle erupted into a frenzy, their terrified bellows echoing through the storm. "Get the herd under control," Jack shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. Will and Hank ran toward the edge of the camp, where the herd was clustering together in blind panic. A flash of lightning lit up the scene, and for a brief moment they saw it, a massive figure, hunched and hairy, its eyes reflecting the light like burning coals. Will's breath caught in his throat. "There it is!" Hank raised his rifle, but by the time he fired, the creature was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Chapter 6. The morning after the storm had passed by dawn, leaving the camp soaked and battered. The men were haggard, their nerves frayed after the long, sleepless night. Jack did a quick count of the herd. "We've lost a few steers," he said, his voice heavy. "Not as bad as it could have been." But Mateo came running from the far side of the grazing area, his face pale. "Jack, you need to see this." The men gathered around another carcass, a young steer, its body mutilated even worse than the first. The ground around it was churned up, the tracks impossibly large and deep. "What in God's name is it doing?" Jed asked, his voice trembling. Jack shook his head, his jaw clenched. "It's sending a message. It wants us to know it's here, and that it can take what it wants. As the men stood around the grisly scene, a distant sound reached their ears. It was a deep, resonant howl, carrying over the plains like a warning. The men froze, their eyes scanning the horizon. "It's watching us," Matteo said quietly. Jack turned to his crew, his face grim but determined. "We keep moving. This thing wants us scared, wants us to run, but we've got a job to do and we're not turning back." Will swallowed hard, the image of the creature's burning eyes still seared into his mind. "And if it doesn't let us go," Jack's eyes were cold and steady, "then we make a stand." The heavy spring rains had turned the trail into a mire, the earth clinging to the hooves of the cattle and dragging at the wheels of the supply wagons. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and damp leather, and the constant drizzle left the men soaked and irritable. "Springtime on the plains," Jack muttered to Jed as they rode ahead of the herd, scouting the route. "Always a fine mess." "Better than a dry summer," Jed replied, though his tone was weary. He pointed toward the horizon, where the gray sky seemed to blend with the distant hills. "The Platts ahead should be swollen by now." Jack nodded grimly. He'd seen rivers like the Platte after the rains, wide, churning, and deceptively fast. Crossing it with 2,100 head of cattle would be no small task. When they reached the river, the sight stopped the crew in their tracks. The Platte was a torrent, its muddy waters rushing past with a roar that drowned out all other sounds. Driftwood and debris swirled in the current, some pieces large enough to smash a steer's legs if they hit wrong. Will stared at the river, his stomach sinking. "How are we supposed to get the herd across that?" Jack dismounted and stood at the water's edge, studying the flow. The river was wider than usual, its banks swollen and slick with mud. "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice steady. "There's no way around and we can't stay here. The longer we wait, the worse it'll get." Matteo frowned, his eyes narrowing at the churning water. "We'll need a good plan. Lose a few cattle to the current and the rest could stampede." The men worked quickly, securing ropes to guide the wagons and identifying the least treacherous section of the riverbank. Matteo and Hank took a small group of riders across first, testing the depth and the strength of the current. "It's bad," Matteo reported when they returned, their horses snorting and trembling. "But it's passable if we keep the herd tight and move fast," Jack nodded. "All right, Matteo, you and Hank take point. Jed and Will, you'll ride the flanks. Keep them moving, and don't let any stragglers fall behind." Will swallowed hard, gripping his reins tightly. The thought of guiding terrified cattle through the river was enough to make his hands shake, but he nodded. "Got it." The first wave of cattle stepped reluctantly into the water, their hooves sinking into the mud. The cowboys shouted and cracked their whips, urging them forward. The lead steers plunged into the current, their bodies bobbing as they fought to keep their footing. The river swallowed them almost to their shoulders, and the herd bellowed in fear. The current tugged at them, threatening to sweep the weaker animals downstream. "Keep 'em moving!" Jack shouted from the rear, his voice barely audible over the roar of the water. Will rode along the edge of the herd, shouting encouragement to the men and the cattle alike. His heart pounded as he watched a young steer lose its footing, its legs flailing as the current pulled it away. "I got it!" Hank yelled, spurring his horse into the water. He lashed a rope around the steer's neck and hauled it back toward the herd, his horse straining against the current. Halfway across, the herd faltered. The lead cattle hesitated as the current grew stronger, their instinct to survive battling their fear of the unknown. The hesitation rippled through the herd, causing the rear to bunch up and push forward in panic. "They're spookin'," Matteo shouted, riding hard to keep the flank steady. Jack cracked his whip, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Keep 'em moving. Don't let 'em stop." Then disaster struck. A massive log hurtled down the river, slamming into the middle of the herd. Cattle scattered, their terrified bellows filling the air. The log struck a steer, flipping it over and dragging it under. Will's horse reared, and he fought to regain control as a wave of panicked cattle surged toward him. "Hold steady," he shouted, though his voice wavered. The chaos threatened to spiral out of control, but Jack's sharp commands and the men's quick thinking turned the tide. Mateo and Hank rode hard, their ropes keeping the herd from splitting entirely. Jed and Will worked the flanks, guiding stragglers back toward the main group. The men were soaked to the bone, their arms aching from the effort, but slowly the herd began to move forward again. When the last of the cattle climbed onto the far bank, the men collapsed onto the muddy ground, their breaths coming in gasps. The herd was battered and exhausted, but they were alive. Jack rode up, his face grim but relieved. "We lost a few," he said quietly, "but we made it." As the men worked to regroup and calm the herd, Mateo knelt by the water's edge, his brow furrowed. "Jack," he called, holding up a piece of driftwood. The men gathered around, their faces darkening as they saw the deep gouges in the wood, claw marks too large and too deliberate to be from any natural creature. Will stared at the marks, his stomach churning. "It followed us," he whispered. Jack's face was like stone as he mounted his horse. "Get the herd moving," he ordered. "We're not stopping until we're clear of this river." As the cattle plodded onward, the men couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the shadows of the distant trees. The Platte River had been a test of endurance, but the real danger was still out there, waiting. Chapter 7: Arrival at Fort Fetterman. The days following the harrowing Platte River crossing passed in an uneasy calm. The cattle settled into their routine, the men's nerves slowly unwinding with each mile. The endless plains stretched ahead, the horizon shimmering in the afternoon heat. For Will, the quiet was almost worse than the chaos. Every rustle of wind through the grass made him jump. Every distant shadow had him gripping the butt of his revolver. He wasn't the only one. The men avoided talking about the mutilated cattle, the claw marks, and the creature's glowing eyes, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud over their camp. By the time they reached the site of Fort Fetterman, they were relieved to see even a semblance of civilization, even if the fort itself was little more than an abandoned shell. Fort Fetterman, once a bustling frontier post, had been closed for years. The buildings were weathered and sagging, their once proud walls now marked by decay. The wind howled through the empty windows, carrying the faint scent of rotting wood. "It's eerie," Mateo muttered as they rode into the fort's crumbling courtyard. "Better than camping in the open," Jack said, though even he seemed uneasy. "We'll use what shelter we can. Get the herd settled just outside the walls and keep a close watch." The men worked quickly, securing the cattle in a makeshift corral and setting up camp in what remained of the old barracks. The walls offered some protection from the elements, but their hollow silence was unnerving. While exploring the fort, Jed stumbled upon something unusual in the officers' quarters: a journal, its leather cover worn but intact. He dusted it off and flipped through the yellowed pages, his brow furrowing as he skimmed the entries. "What did you find?" Will asked, peering over his shoulder. Jed held up the journal, his expression grim. "Looks like it belonged to one of the officers stationed here before they shut the place down." Will glanced at the scrawled handwriting. "Anything useful?" Jed nodded slowly. "More than I'd like. Listen to this." He read aloud. June 14th, 1876. Another patrol reported strange tracks in the forest west of the fort. Larger than any bear I've ever seen. The men are on edge, claiming it's the hairy man the Lakota speak of. I dismissed it as superstition until I saw the tracks myself. June 21st, 1876. We've lost 3 cattle from the fort's stock. The carcasses were found mutilated as if by massive claws. The men are scared, and I can't blame them. June 28th, 1876. The howls started again last night, low, guttural, and too close for comfort. I've posted extra guards, but morale is crumbling. I fear whatever is out there isn't just an animal. Fort Fetterman marked the edge of the plains and the gateway to the towering Bighorn Mountains. Beyond the fort, the trail would climb into rugged terrain, where narrow passes and dense forests would make herding cattle an even greater challenge. For Jack and his crew, the looming peaks were both a promise of progress and a harbinger of danger. The men worked tirelessly to regroup after their night at the fort, knowing it would be the last semblance of shelter for days. Supplies were checked and double-checked, the cattle were counted, and the horses were rested. Yet, a heavy unease hung over the group. "We're heading into its territory," Jed muttered to Mateo as they loaded the wagons. "The journal said the tracks came from the west. That means the mountains." Mateo nodded grimly. "We've seen what it can do in open country. Imagine what it'll be like up there." Thanks so much from Cryptid Monologues for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss an update. And hey, while you're here, check out these videos. You'll definitely love them. See you in the next one.